Robert Cosgrove Greenlease Jr. was born on the 3rd of February 1947 and passed away on the 28th of December 1953. He was a 6-year-old from Kansas City, Missouri, United States. He was the victim of a kidnapping and unaliving on the 28th of September 1953. His father, Robert Cosgrove Greenlease Sr., was a multi-millionaire auto dealer, and the demanded ransom payment was the largest in American history at the time. Greenlease Jr.'s kidnappers, Cal Hall and Bonnie Heady, had no intention of returning him to his family. The child had been unalived before the ransom demand was even issued. Both perpetrators were sentenced to death and executed. Both perpetrators were sentenced to unaliving and executed in Missouri's gas chamber in December 1953. Heady was the third woman ever to be executed by U.S. federal authorities. Robert Bobby Cosgrove Greenlease Jr. was born to Robert Greenlease Sr. and Virginia Pollock Greenlease, his second wife. They were married in 1939. Greenlease's first wife was Betty Bessie Rush, who he married on the 3rd of March 1913. His father was a multi-millionaire car dealer and entrepreneur, having made his fortune by introducing General Motors vehicles to the Great Plains in the early 20th century, owning dealerships from Texas to South Dakota. He was 65 years old when Bobby was born in 1947. The Greenleases were said to have been devoted to Bobby. According to author John Hedenry, Bobby was said to be a trusting boy. Bonnie Heady later stated that from the moment she appeared at his school posing as his aunt to take him to his mother, he just took her hand and did anything he was told to do. Cal Hall was born Cal Austin Hall on the 1st of July 1919. He passed away on the 18th of December 1953, aged 34, in Missouri State Penitentiary, Jefferson City, Missouri, United States. Bonnie Heady was born Bonnie Emily Brown on the 15th of July 1912. She passed away on the 18th of December 1953, aged 41, in Missouri State Penitentiary, Jefferson City, Missouri, United States. Cal Austin Hall, a once wealthy man who had been accustomed to living a lavish lifestyle before squandering away his inheritance, was arrested in 1951 for robbing taxicab drivers of a total of $33. Although sentenced to 5 years in prison, he served just over 2. It was there he began plotting his next get-rich-quick scheme, a ransom kidnapping. After meeting Bonnie Heady in a bar in May 1953 and moving in with her a mere 2 days later, Hall let her in on his plan. She was a more than willing accomplice, which set the stage for an unfortunate ending to the Greenlease story. In September 1953, Cal Hall and Bonnie Heady kidnapped Bobby from Notre Dame de Sion, a Catholic preschool located in Kansas City, Missouri. In the early 1930s, Hall had attended Kemper Military School in Boonville with Paul Robert Greenlease, Bobby's adopted older brother. Hall had planned for years to victimize his former classmate's wealthy family. At approximately 10:55 a.m., Heady visited Bobby's school and persuaded a nun, Sister Moran, that she was his aunt, telling her that his mother had suffered a heart attack and was in St. Mary's Hospital. The woman appeared visibly upset and apologized to Sister Moran for her condition. Upon getting Bobby, Sister Moran told him that his aunt had called at the school for him, but she did not tell Bobby that his mother had suffered a heart attack. Sister Moran recalled that Bobby walked directly to the woman without hesitation and that there was nothing in his action or behaviour to indicate doubt on this part that the woman was his aunt. As the woman left the school, she had an arm round Bobby's shoulder and was holding his hand. She then took Bobby away in a taxi driven by John Oliver Hager of the Ace Cab Company, who would testify in court. When another nun from the school rang to inquire about Virginia Greenlease's condition, she discovered the truth, and her husband contacted the FBI. Hall and Heady took the child across state lines to Johnson County, Kansas, where Hall fatally wounded him with a snub .38 caliber revolver. They took the child's body to St. Joseph and buried him in the backyard of Heady's house at 1 201 South 38th Street. Willard Person Creech, cab driver for Toad Moon Cab Company in Kansas City, told authorities that shortly before 11 a.m., a woman whose description fit the one of the woman who had called at the school entered the cab and requested him to drive her to the school of the Notre Dame de Sion. Upon arriving at the school, she told Creech to wait on her because she had wanted to be driven to the Cat's Drug Store and Westport and Main Street in Kansas City. In approximately 6 minutes, this woman re-entered the cab, accompanied by a small boy fitting the description of Bobby Greenhouse. When Creech last saw them, they had stopped behind a blue 1952 or 1953 Ford sedan bearing Kansas license plates. After the murder, Hall and Heddy sent Bobby's father messages in the mail and phone calls demanding a ransom of $600,000, which would equate to $6.6 million today. Greenlease, desperately trying to save his son, held off the authorities and paid the money. At that time, it was the largest ransom ever paid in American history, and remained so until the 1972 kidnapping of Virginia Piper. Hall became convinced that police would trace him and Heddy to St. Joseph's, so he randomly decided to drive to St. Louis. The couple collected the ransom and fled. A few hours after the kidnapping, the Greenleases received the first ransom letter concerning the return of their son. The first letter, mailed special delivery and postmarked 6 p.m. on the 28th of September 1953, demanded $600,000 in $20 and $10 bills to be placed in a duffel bag. The kidnappers promised Bobby's safe return in 24 hours and as long as there were no tricks in delivering the money. The second ransom letter was postmarked at 9:30 p.m. on the 29th of September 1953. Inside the envelope in which this letter was mailed was the Jerusalem medal which had been worn by Bobby Greenlease. The letter again contained demands for $600,000 and stated that Bobby was okay but homesick. Overall, the Greenleases received over half a dozen ransom notes and 15 telephone calls. The final communication between the Greenleases and the kidnappers was a telephone call received at 1 a.m. on the 5th of October 1953 at the Greenlease residence. The kidnappers stated that they had received the $600,000 ransom money and assured that the Greenleases that their son was alive and that he would be returned in 24 hours. When the two unalivers took their ransom money and travelled approximately 300 miles to St. Louis, Missouri. On the 5th of October 1953, Hall purchased 2 metal suitcases and transferred the ransom money from the duffel bag to these suitcases, leaving the duffel bag in an ash pit in South St. Louis. Cal Hall took Bonnie Heddy, who was drunk, to an apartment he rented on Arsenal Street, also in St. Louis. Heddy immediately went to sleep and Hall deserted her there, leaving only $2,000 of the $600,000 ransom money in her purse. On the 6th of October 1953, Hall purchased 2 large garbage cans and a shovel, placed them in a rented car and drove to Marmac River in St. Louis County, where he intended to bury the ransom money. However, he could not find a suitable place. He left the cans in a deserted clubhouse and drove back to the Coral Courts motel where he was staying. Hall became suspicious of persons in the vicinity of the motel during the afternoon of the 6th of October 1953 and moved to an apartment at the Townhouse Hotel in St. Louis. A telephone call was received at the 11th District St. Louis Police Department at about 3:30 p.m. on the 6th of October 1953 from John Oliver Hager. His information led to the arrest of Carl Austin Hall, who identified himself as John James Byrne, by officers of the St. Louis Police Department at the Townhouse Hotel in St. Louis during the same evening. Later that night, he led the officers to an apartment on Arsenal Street in St. Louis where Hall's girlfriend, Bonnie Emily Heddy, was taken into custody. Hall was interrogated by FBI agents and other law enforcement agencies several times after his arrest and emphatically insisted that practically all of the $600,000 ransom money was in his possession at the time he was arrested by St. Louis Police Department. Hall admitted to FBI agents the planning of the kidnapping, the actual abduction of the victim, and to burying the body in the yard of Miss Heady's residence. He also admitted picking up the ransom money but denied that he unalived the victim. At this time, he implicated Tom Marsh, stating that he turned the victim over to Marsh. Hall later admitted Marsh was a fictitious individual and the only persons involved in the kidnapping were Bonnie Heady and himself. It was not until the 11th of October 1953 that Hall admitted that he and Bonnie Heady transported the victim from Kansas City, Missouri to a point just outside of Kansas City in Overland Park, Kansas, where he shot the victim. He then transported the body approximately 40 miles back to St. Joseph, Missouri, where he buried him in Bonnie Heady's yard and planted flowers on his grave. Bonnie Heady admitted in assisting Hall in the preparation of the ransom letters and notes of instructions to the Greenlease family concerning the payoff of the ransom, as well as going to the school and obtaining custody of the victim using the ruse that his mother was ill. The boy's body was found by FBI agents at 8:40 a.m. on the 7th of October 1953, buried near the porch of the Heady residence at 1201 South 38th Street in St. Joseph, Missouri. The body had been wrapped in a plastic bag and a large quantity of lime had been poured over this bag. The Greenlease family dentist identified the body as that of Bobby Greenlease at 1:05 p.m. on the 7th of October 1953. Bloodstains were found on the basement floor and steps to the Heady residence, and a nylon blouse and a fibre rug. Some .38 caliber shell casings were also found in the house. These shell casings were examined by the FBI laboratory, and it was found that they had been fired from a .38 caliber snub-nose Smith & Wesson revolver in Hall's possession at the time of his arrest. The FBI laboratory also ascertained that a lead bullet recovered from a rubber floor mat in the Plymouth station wagon owned by Bonnie Heady was also fired from Hall's .34 caliber revolver. Hall contacted criminal associates to enlist their help in diverting police attention. One of the associates, named Sarah O'Day, was supposed to fly to Los Angeles and mail a letter Hall had written. It was thought that this would divert police attention from St. Louis. However, O'Day caught a glimpse of the ransom money. St. Louis police soon learned that Hall was flaunting a large sum of money and they brought him in for questioning. Hall eventually implicated Heady. Bobby was later interred in the family mausoleum at Forest Hill Cavalry Cemetery in Kansas City. Because he had been taken over state lines, the crime became a federal case under the Federal Kidnapping Act. Hall and Heady both pleaded guilty to kidnapping. The jury deliberated an hour and 8 minutes before recommending a death sentence. Judge Reeves, who also sentenced them to death, said, "I think the verdict fits the evidence. It's the most cold-blooded, brutal murder I have ever tried." The two were executed together in the Missouri gas chamber on the 18th of December 1953. Only 11 weeks and 4 days passed between the time the crime was committed and the executions. Neither Hall nor Heady made any attempts to appeal. Heady is one of only 4 women to have ever been executed by federal authorities as of 2021. The others being Lincoln assassination conspirator Mary Surratt in 1865 and Ethel Rosenberg, who along with her husband Julius was convicted of being a Soviet spy and executed by electric chair on the 19th of June 1953, just months before Heady. The 4th woman, Lisa Montgomery of Kansas, was executed by lethal injection on the 13th of January 2021 for the 2004 murder of Bobby Joe Sinnott. Since the federal government did not have any execution facilities, Missouri's state facilities and thus the then legal gas chamber were used to carry out the executions. This was the case for all federal executions in the 20th century before the first executions at the federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana in 2001. Heady is the only woman executed by the federal government by gassing. Heady is buried in Claremont, Nordway County, Missouri, where she grew up. Only $288,000 of the ransom money was recovered. The missing $312,000 remained subject of wide speculation. Some theories accounting for this were: a cab driver who took Hall to the Coral Court Motel had tipped off local mobster Joseph G. Costello. Hall had tried unsuccessfully to bury the cash near the Merrimack River, though the FBI later searched the area in vain. Suitcases in Hall's possession upon his arrest were not brought to the 11th District Precinct Station by the arresting officers Lieutenant Lewis, Ira Shoulders, and Patrolman Elmer Dolan. Shoulders and Dolman told the grand jury that the $288,000 they turned over was the full amount seized from Hall when they arrested him. This statement was determined to be false. In fact, it was alleged that Shoulders had taken the balance of the $600,000 ransom that Hall had on him at the time of the arrest. Both officers were subsequently federally indicted for and convicted of perjury. Shoulders was convicted on the 15th of April 1954 and sentenced to 3 years in prison. He passed away on the 12th of May 1962. Dolan was convicted on the 31st of March 1954 and sentenced to 2 years in prison. In 1962, he informed the FBI that he had perjured because his fear of Shoulders exceeded his fear of prison. Dolan received a pardon from US President Lyndon B. Johnson on the 21st of July 1965. Julius Rosenberg and Ethel Rosenberg were an American married couple who were convicted of spying for the Soviet Union, including providing top-secret information about American radar, sonar, jet propulsion engines, and nuclear weapon designs. Convicted of espionage in 1951, they were executed by the federal government of the United States in 1953 at Sing Sing in Ossining, New York, becoming the first American civilians to be executed for such charges and the first to be executed during peacetime. Other convicted co-conspirators were sentenced to prison, including Ethel's brother David Greenglass, who made a plea agreement, Harry Gold, and Morton Sobel. Klaus Fuchs, a German scientist working at Los Alamos Laboratory, was convicted in the United Kingdom. For decades, many people, including the Rosenberg son, Michael and Robert Meerpool, maintained that Julius and Ethel were innocent of spying on their country and were victims of Cold War paranoia. When the US government declassified information about them after the fall of the Soviet Union, the declassified information appeared to have included a trove of decoded Soviet cables, codename Venona, which detailed Julius's role as a courier and recruiter for the Soviets, and information about Ethel's role as an accessory who helped recruit her brother David into the spy ring and did clerical tasks such as typing up documents that Julius then passed to the Soviets. In 2008, the National Archives of the United States published most of the grand jury testimony related to the prosecution of the Rosenbergs. Julius Rosenberg was born on the 12th of May 1918 in New York City to a family of Jewish immigrants from the Russian Empire. The family moved to the Lower East Side by the time Julius was 11. His parents worked in the shops of the Lower East Side as Julius attended Seward Park High School. Julius became a leader in the Young Communist League USA while at City College of New York during the Great Depression. In 1939, he graduated with a degree in electrical engineering. Ethel Greenglass was born on the 28th of September 1915 to a Jewish family in Manhattan. She had a brother, David Greenglass. She originally was an aspiring actress and singer, but eventually took a secretarial job at a shipping company. She became involved in labour disputes and joined the Young Communist League, where she met Julius in 1936. They married in 1939. Julius joined the Army Signal Corps Engineering Laboratories at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey in 1940, where he worked as an engineer inspector until 1945. He was discharged when the US Army discovered his previous membership to the Communist Party USA. Important research on electronics, communications, radar and guided missile controls were undertaken at Fort Monmouth during World War II. According to a 2001 book by his former handler, Alexander Feklislov, Rosenberg was originally recruited to spy for an interior ministry of the Soviet Union, NKVD, on Labor Day 1942 by a former spy master, Semyon Semenov. By this time, following the invasion by Germany in June 1941, the Soviet Union had become an ally of the Western powers, which included the US after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Rosenberg had been introduced to Semenov by Bernard Schuser, a high-ranking member of the Communist Party USA and NKVD liaison for Earl Browder. After Semenov was recalled to Moscow in 1944, his duties were taken over by Feliskov. Rosenberg provided thousands of classified reports from Emerson Radio, including a complete proximity fuse. Under Feliskov's supervision, Rosenberg recruited sympathetic individuals into NKVD service, including Joel Barr, Alfred Sarin, William Pearl, and Morton Sobel, also an engineer. Pearl supplied Fekislov under Rosenberg's direction with thousands of documents from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, including a complete set of design and production drawings for Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, the first US operational jet fighter. Fekislov learned through Rosenberg that David was working on a top-secret Manhattan project in the Los Alamos National Laboratory. He directed Julius to recruit Greenglass. In February 1944, Rosenberg succeeded in recruiting a second source of Manhattan Project information, engineer Russell McNutt, who worked on designs for the plants at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. For this success, Rosenberg received a $100 bonus. McNutt's employment provided access to secrets about the process of manufacturing weapon-grade uranium. The US did not share information with, nor seek assistance from, the Soviet Union regarding the Manhattan Project. The West was shocked by the speed with which the Soviets were able to stage Joe-1, its first nuclear test, on the 29th of August 1949. However, Lavrenti Beria, the head official for the Soviet nuclear project, used foreign intelligence only as a third-party check rather than giving it directly to the design teams. He did not clear to know about the espionage efforts, and the developments were indigenous. Considering the pace of the Soviet program was set primarily by the amount of uranium that it could procure, it is difficult from scholars to judge accurately how much time was saved, if any. In January 1950, the US discovered that Klaus Fuchs, a German refugee and theoretical physicist working for the British mission in the Manhattan Project, had given key documents to the Soviets throughout the war. Fuchs identified his carrier as American Harry Gold, who was arrested on the 23rd of May 1950. On the 15th of June 1950, Greenglass was arrested by the FBI for espionage and soon confessed to having passed secret information to the USSR through Gold. He also claimed that Julius had convinced David's wife Ruth to recruit him while visiting him in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 1944. He said that Julius had passed secrets and thus linked him to the Soviet contact agent Anatoly Yakovlev. This connection would be necessary as evidence if there was to be a connection for espionage for the Rosenbergs. On the 17th of July 1950, Julius was arrested on suspicion of espionage based on Greenglass's confession. On the 11th of August 1950, Ethel was arrested after testifying before a grand jury. Another conspirator, Morton Sobel, fled with his family to Mexico City after Greenglass was arrested. They took assumed names and he tried to figure out a way to reach Europe without a passport. Abandoning that effort, he returned to Mexico City. He claimed that he was kidnapped by members of the Mexican secret police and driven to the US border where he was arrested by US forces. The US government claimed that Sobel was arrested by Mexican police for bank robbery on the 16th of August 1950, and he was extradited the next day to the United States in Laredo, Texas. 20 senior government officials met secretly on the 8th of February 1950 to discuss the Rosenberg case. Gordon Dean, the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, said, "It looks as though Rosenberg is the kingpin of a very large ring. If there is any way of breaking him by having the shadow of death penalty over him, we want to do it." Miles Lane, a member of the prosecution team, said that the case against Ethel was not too strong, but that it was very important that she be convicted too and given a stiff sentence. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover wrote that proceeding against the wife will serve as a lever to make Julius talk. The case against Ethel was resolved in 10 days before the start of the trial, when David and Ruth Greenglass were interviewed a second time. They were persuaded to change their original stories. David originally said that he'd passed the atomic data that he'd collected to Julius at a New York street corner. After being interviewed the second time, he said that he'd given the information to Julius in his living room of the Rosenbergs' New York apartment. Ethel, at Julius's request, had taken his notes and typed them up. In a second interview, Ruth expanded on her husband's version. Julius then took the info into the bathroom and read it. When he came out, he called Ethel and told her she had to type the information immediately. Ethel then sat down at the typewriter, which she placed on a bridge table in the living room, then proceeded to type the information that David had given to Julius. As a result of this new testimony, all charges against Ruth were dropped. On the 11th of August, Ethel testified before a grand jury. For all questions, she asserted her right to not answer as provided by the US Constitution's Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination. FBI agents took her into custody as she left the courthouse. Her attorney asked the US Commissioner to parole her in his custody over the weekend so that she could make arrangements for her two young children. The request was denied. Julius and Ethel were put under pressure to incriminate others involved in the spy ring. Neither offered any further information. On the 17th of August, the grand jury returned an indictment alleging 11 overt acts. Both Julius and Ethel were indicted, as were David Greenglass and Yakovlev. The trial of the Rosenbergs and Sobel on federal espionage charges began on the 6th of March 1951 in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York. Judge Irving Kaufman presided over the trial with Assistant U.S. Attorney Ivan Sapol, leading the prosecution and criminal defense lawyer Emanuel Bloch, representing the Rosenbergs. The prosecution's primary witness, David Greenglass, said that he turned over to Julius a sketch of the cross-section of an implosion-type atomic bomb. This was the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki, Japan, as opposed to the bomb with the gun method triggering device using the little boy bomb dropped on Hiroshima. On the 29th of March 1951, the Rosenbergs were convicted of espionage. They were sentenced to death on the 5th of April under the Section 2 of the Espionage Act of 1917, which provides that anyone convicted of transmitting or attempted to transmit to a foreign government information relating to the national defence may be imprisoned for life or put to death. Prosecutor Ray Cohn later claimed that his influence led to both Kaufman and Sapol being appointed to the Rosenberg case, and that Kaufman imposed the death penalty based on Cohn's personal recommendation. Cohn would later go on to work for Senator Joseph McCarthy, appointed as chief counsel to the investigations subcommittee during McCarthy's tenure as chairman of the Senate Government Operations Committee. In imposing the death penalty, Kaufman noted that he held the Rosenbergs responsible for not only espionage but for American deaths in the Korean War. I believe your conduct in putting into the hands of the Russians the A-bomb years before our best scientists predicted Russia would perfect the bomb has already caused, in my opinion, the communist aggression in Korea, with the resultant casualties exceeding 50,000, and who knows but that millions more of innocent people may pay the price of your treason. Indeed, by your betrayal you undoubtedly have altered the course of history to the disadvantage of our country. The US government offered to spare the lives of both Julius and Ethel if Julius provided the names of other spies and they admitted their guilt. The Rosenbergs made a public statement. By asking us to repudiate the truth of our innocence, the government admits its own doubts concerning our guilt. We will not be coerced, even under the pain of death, to bear false witness. After the publication of an investigative series in the National Guardian and the formation of the National Committee to Secure Justice in the Rosenberg case, some Americans came to believe that both Rosenbergs were innocent or had received too harsh a sentence, particularly Ethel. A campaign was started to try and prevent the couple's execution. Between the trial and the executions, there were widespread protests and claims of anti-Semitism. At a time where Americans' fears about communism were high, the Rosenbergs did not receive support from mainstream Jewish organizations. The American Civil Liberties Union did not find any civil liberty violations in the case. Across the world, especially in Western European capitals, there were numerous protests with picketing and demonstrations in favour of the Rosenbergs, along with editorials in otherwise pro-American newspapers. John Paul Sartre, an existentialist philosopher and left-wing political activist, described the trial as a legal lynching. Others included non-communists such as John Kokotow and Harold Urey, a Nobel Prize-winning physical chemist, as well as left-leaning figures, some being communists such as Nelson Algren, Bertolt Brecht, Albert Einstein, Dashiell Hammett, Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, protested the position of the American government in what the French termed as the American Dauphren affair. Einstein and Urey pleaded with President Harry S. Truman to pardon the Rosenbergs. In May 1951, Pablo Picasso wrote for the communist French newspaper Le Humanitaire, "The hours count, the minutes count, do not let this crime against humanity take place." The All-Black Labour Union International Longshoremen's Association Local 968 stopped working for a day in protest. Cinema artists such as Fritz Lang registered their protest. President Eisenhower, supported by public opinion and the media at home, ignored the overseas demands. Pope Pius XII appealed to Eisenhower to spare the couple, but Eisenhower refused on the 11th of February 1953. All other appeals were also unsuccessful. The execution was delayed from the scheduled date on the 18th of June because Supreme Court Associate Justice William O. Douglas had granted a stay of execution on the previous day. This stay resulted from an intervention in the case by Fyke Farmer, a Tennessee lawyer whose efforts had been scorned by Block. The execution was scheduled for 11 p.m. on the evening of the 19th of June, during the Sabbath, which begins and ends around sunset. Block asked for more time, filing a complaint that the execution on the Sabbath offended the defendant's Jewish heritage. Rhoda Lacks, another attorney on the Rosenberg's defense team, also made this argument before Judge Kaufman. The defense's strategy backfired. Kaufman, who stated his concerns about executing the Rosenbergs on the Sabbath, rescheduled the execution for 8 p.m. before sunset and the Sabbath, the regular time for executions at Sing Sing, where they were being held. On the 19th of June 1953, Julius died from the first electric shock. Ethel's execution did not go smoothly. After she was given the normal course of 3 electric shocks, attendants removed the strapping and other equipment only to have doctors determine that her heart was still beating. 2 more electric shocks were applied, and the conclusion eyewitnesses reported that smoke rose from her head. The Rosenbergs were the only American civilians executed for espionage during the Cold War. The funeral services were held in Brooklyn on the 21st of June. The Rosenbergs were buried at Wellwood Cemetery, a Jewish cemetery in Pine Lawn, New York. The Times reported that 500 people attended and some 10,000 people stood outside. The bodies had been brought from Sing Sing prison to the National. The bodies had been brought from Sing Sing prison by the National Rosenberg Committee, which undertook the funeral arrangements, and an all-night vigil was held in one of the largest mortuary chapels in Brooklyn. Most of them clearly regarding the Rosenbergs as martyred heroes, and more than 500 mourners attended today's services, while a crowd estimated at 10,000 stood outside in burning heat. Mr. Block, their counsel, who delivered one of the main orations, bitterly exclaimed that America was living under the heel of a military dictator garbed in civilian attire, and the Rosenbergs were sweet, tender, and intelligent, and that the course they took was one of courage and heroism. In 1953, socialist historian W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a poem titled The Rosenbergs. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Vice Chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, investigated how much the Soviet spy ring helped the USSR to build its bomb. Moynihan found that in 1945, physicist Hans Bethe estimated that the Soviets would build its bomb within 5 years, thanks to information provided by their agents. Moynihan wrote in his book Secrecy, they did it in 4. Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union from 1953 to 1964, wrote in his posthumously published memoir that he cannot specifically say what kind of help the Rosenbergs provided us, but that he learned from Joseph Stalin and Vyacheslav Molotov that they had provided very significant help in accelerating the production of our atomic bomb. Boris V. Brokhnovich, the engineer who later became director of Chelyabinsk 40, the plutonium production reactor and extraction facility that the Soviet Union used to create its first bomb material, alleged that Khrushchev was a silly fool. He said that Soviets had developed their own bomb by trial and error. You sat the Rosenbergs in an electric chair for nothing, he said. We got nothing from the Rosenbergs. The notes allegedly typed by Ethel apparently contained little that was directly used in the Soviet atomic bomb project. According to Julius's contact with Felix Sklov, the Rosenbergs did not provide the Soviet Union with any useful material about the atomic bomb. He, Julius, didn't understand anything about the atomic bomb and couldn't help us. The Verona project was a United States counterintelligence program to decrypt messages transmitted by the intelligence agencies of the Soviet Union. Initiated when the Soviet Union was an ally of the US, the program continued during the Cold War when it was considered an enemy. The Verona messages did not feature the Rosenbergs' trial, which relied instead on testimony from their collaborators, but they heavily informed the US government overall approach to investigating and prosecuting domestic communists. In 1995, the US government made public many documents decoded by the Verona project, showing Julius's role as part of the productive ring of spies. For example, a 1944 cable, which gives the name of Ruth Greenlass in clear text, says that Ruth's husband David is being recruited as a spy by his sister, that is Ethel, and her husband. The cable also makes clear that the sister's husband is involved enough in espionage to have his own codename, a tenor later liberal. Ethel did not have a codename, however. KGB messages, which were contained in the Venona Project's Alexander Vasilev files, which were not made public until 2009, revealed that both Ethel and Julius had regular contact with at least 2 KGB agents, and were active in recruiting both David Greenglass and Russell McNutt. In 2001, David Greenglass recanted his testimony about his sister having typed the notes. He said, "I frankly think my wife did the typing, but I don't remember." He said he gave false testimony to protect himself and his wife, and that he was encouraged by the prosecution to do so. "My wife is more important than my sister, or my mother or father, okay? And she was the mother of my children." He refused to express remorse on his decision to betray his sister, saying only that he did not realise that the prosecution would push for the death penalty. He stated, "I would not sacrifice my wife and my children for my sister." At the grand jury, Ruth Greenglass was asked, "Didn't you write the information down on a piece of paper?" She replied, "Yes, I wrote the information down on a piece of paper, and Julius Rosenberg took it with him." But at the trial, she testified that Ethel typed the notes about the atomic bomb. Numerous articles were published in 2008 related to the Rosenberg case. Deputy Attorney General of the United States William P. Rogers, who had been part of the prosecution of the Rosenbergs, discussed their strategy at the time in relation to seeking the death sentence for Ethel. He said that he urged the death sentence for Ethel in an effort to extract a full confession from Julius. He reportedly said, "She called our bluff, as she made no effort to push her husband to any action." In September 2008, Morton Sabel was interviewed by the New York Times after his revelations from grand jury testimony. He admitted that he had given documents to the Soviet contact, but said these had to do with defense radar and weaponry. He confirmed that Julius was in a conspiracy that delivered to the Soviets classified military and industrial information on the atomic bomb, and he never told me about anything else that he was engaged in. He said that he thought about the hand-drawn diagrams and other atomic bomb details acquired by Greenglass and passed on to Julius were of little value to the Soviet Union, and were used only to corroborate what they had learned from the other atomic spies. He also said that he believed Ethel was aware of her husband's deeds but took no part in them. In a follow-up letter to the New York Times, 1 week after the first interview was published, Sabel denied that he knew anything about Julius's alleged atomic espionage activities, and that the only thing that he knew for sure was what he himself did in association with Julius. In 2009, extensive notes collected from KGB archives were made public in a book published by Yale University Press, Spies, The Rise and Fall of the KGB in America, written by John L. Haynes, Harvey Clare, and Alexander Vasilev. Vasilev's notebooks included KGB comments concerning Julius and Ethel. The notebooks made clear that the KGB considered Julius an effective agent and Ethel a supporter of his work. According to Vasilev, Julius and Ethel worked personally with the KGB agents who were given codenames Twain and Kalistrauss, and were described as being the ones who recruited Greenglass and McNutt for their Manhattan Project spy mission. Though the public release of Vasilev's notebooks did not occur until 2009, the notebooks had in fact been originally intercepted during the Venona decryptions. The Rosenbergs' 2 sons, Michael and Robert, spent years trying to prove the innocence of their parents. They were orphaned by the executions and were not adopted by many aunts or uncles, although they initially spent time under the care of their grandmothers and in a children's home. They were adopted by communist activists Abel Mirpool and his wife Anne, and assumed the Mirpool surname. After Sabel's 2008 confession, they acknowledged their father had been involved in espionage, but that their view on the case was riddled with prosecutorial and judicial misconduct, that their mother was convicted on flimsy evidence to place leverage on her husband, and that neither deserved the death penalty. Michael and Robert co-wrote a book about their and their parents' lives, We Are Your Sons, The Legacy of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, in 1975. Robert wrote the memoir An Execution in the Family, One Son's Journey in 2003. In 1990, he founded the Rosenberg Fund for Children, a non-profit foundation that provides support for children of targeted liberal activists and youth who are targeted as activists. Michael's daughter, Ivy Meerpool, directed a 2004 documentary about her grandparents, Heir to an Execution, which was featured at the Sundance Film Festival. Their son's current position is that Julius was legally guilty of the conspiracy charge, though not of atomic spying, while Ethel was only generally aware of his activities. The children say that their father did not deserve the death penalty and that their mother was wrongly convicted. They continue to campaign for Ethel to be posthumously legally exonerated. In 2015, following the most recent grand jury transcript release, Michael and Robert Meerpool called on US President Barack Obama's administration to acknowledge that Ethel's conviction and execution was wrongful and to issue a proclamation exonerating her, though her innocence is still not proven. In March 2016, Michael and Robert, via the Rosenberg Fund for Children, launched a petition campaign calling on President Obama and US Attorney General Loretta Lynch to formally exonerate Ethel. In October 2016, both Michael and Robert Meerpool spoke with Anderson Cooper in an interview which aired on 60 Minutes. In January 2016, Senator Elizabeth Warren sent Obama a letter requesting consideration for the exoneration request. In 2021, Ethel's sons restarted the campaign to pardon Ethel as they were optimistic that President Joe Biden would consider this favourably. Ethel Rosenberg, A Cold War Tragedy by Anne Sieber was published by Orion Books in 2021. As of June 2023, Michael and Robert are requesting Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines to release the records related to their mother's case, per a 2009 Obama's executive order.